Hello, John Carter Nation! Okay, can we agree that the 2012 John Carter movie was not a masterpiece? Is that crazy for me to say? I only just watched this movie very recently after reading this book, A Princess of Mars, which it's adapted from. I was on this kick of reading these classic Sword and Planet books, and among these, the Barsoom series is probably the most well-known. Anyway, you've probably heard countless times about things being removed from a book for adaptations to the screen, but the John Carter movie actually does the opposite, adding a whole faction and Deus Ex Machina technology from the later books into this initial story that it did not include originally. I don't think this is notable on its face, because clearly putting the Therns, that's what they're called, here in the first movie was setting them up to be overarching antagonists if the movie was successful, which it was not, unfortunately. But I want to talk about they and a few other seemingly surface level choices, basically really completely changing what kind of story this is. And I want to start off with John Carter himself, which is really the big one. When we sit down to watch big screen action movies today, we expect that they will follow certain heroes' journey, story beats, right? And the points of development for learning for the protagonist are very important. Among these beats, it requires that the hero start a certain way and end somewhere markedly different, often shedding or overcoming a character flaw. Doctor Strange becomes less self-absorbed, Peter Parker learns responsibility, Indiana Jones sheds an obsession with the past's treasures, and countless characters simply come to just trust in themselves, Aragorn in the Lord of the Rings movies doubts himself based on his bloodline and Isildur's failure, but in the books, Aragorn really has no such problems. He was not exiled as much as he just bided his time and embraced his destiny even as part of the Dunedain. He has the pieces of Narsil with him at the beginning of the story, and they're being reborn as Anduril comes at the Council of Elrond, symbolically sanctifying the Fellowship's mission as opposed to being a token of confidence from Elrond to Aragorn that the latter needed to finish his arc. Yeah? John Carter experiences similar additions in translation. In the film, Carter begins as essentially a ceaselessly rebellious ruffian without any loyalties, but with legendary combat skills from the Civil War. He won't cooperate with these soldiers, he's no friend of the Apaches, and he gives the Tharks on Mars the same treatment, at first at least. The arc he goes through in the movie is basically learning commitment and loyalty to the well-being of Mars, stemming from his falling for his babe, Dejah Thoris. The savage planet Barsoom is ironically what makes Carter honorable. While the Princess of Mars is still Carter's primary motivation in the book, Carter himself does not change to suit her or to Barsoom. Edgar Rice Burroughs, in his wonderful framing of the story, describes John right off the bat as an honorable and morally excellent person, and in fact the picture of aspirational conduct and ability. The thematic conflict of the movie is Carter's conflict with his old self, while in the book it is the clash between Carter's very solidified code of ethics and the culture of Barsoom. J.R.R. Tolkien would probably call A Princess of Mars a traveler's tale, along the lines of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Such tales, he argues, report many marvels, but they are marvels to be seen in this mortal world, in some region of our own time and space. Distance alone conceals them. Unquote. The Lilliputians of Swift's story, when stripped of their outward novelties, are simply, quote, men peered down at sardonically, unquote. Or, in other words, not actually different in nature from the human beings one encounters in the real world, but rather representative of a facet of our nature. The franchise to distill and essentially perfect this story form is Star Trek, wherein each alien species is defined by an outsized version of a human personality trait. The Vulcans are strictly logical, the Ferengi are greedy, the Romulans conniving and vindictive, etc. In an episode of Star Trek, when the protagonists clash with a group of these aliens, the virtues to which they adhere, those of Starfleet, are tested against the flawed states in human nature that the aliens represent. From repeated storylines of this sort, the basic question of the story becomes, how airtight are Starfleet's ideals? Or, put differently, can this code of ethics weather adversity, whether it's physical or ideological? This metaphorical use of the fantastical is present in many classic travelers' tales, and A Princess of Mars is no exception. In fact, the framing implies an even more literal relation between the human and the alien, something like what we see in The Wizard of Oz. In that movie, the people from Dorothy's mundane life are pretty directly reflected in her companions in Oz. In Burroughs' story, John Carter's pre-Mars companion Powell and the Apache warriors the two men fight are also duplicated in Martian visage as Kantos Kan and the Tharks, respectively. Against these and many other forces, Carter's code as a former Confederate captain are tested, and indeed, his consistent application of his set of values, confidence, intrepidness, aversion to most violence, are often shown to be his key to success on Mars. The characters he interacts with often grow and succeed by also adopting them. Of course, a story like A Princess of Mars is written around this dynamic, and its plot is designed to feature situations where John Carter's specific philosophy can win him the day. It's for this reason that changing that philosophy, while keeping the plot, for the most part, as the movie does, sets the whole thing off kilter. Book John falls in with Tars Tarkas and the Tharks because they respect each other as martial leaders and because John wants justice for Sola, but movie John only kind of begrudgingly coexists with the Tharks and only really gains them as allies right before the last act. John Carter and Tars Tarkas have a very cool, unlikely friendship in the book, and both of their decisions are influenced by their connection to one another, but this relationship is very much sidelined in the film, where the Virginian is motivated almost solely by the princess who awakens a sense of duty in him. Okay, now let's talk about the Therns a little bit. Enough about John. Like I said at the beginning, these guys, they're not in A Princess of Mars. In the movie, John Carter, they are a threat beyond the rival Green Martians or the Zodangans, and are used to create some larger lore surrounding Earth, Mars, and the rest of the universe. Scale was kind of another thing that had to change for the movie. In the 1910s, when the story was initially published, there was a sort of Mars craze in the Western world, spurred by the telescopic observations of one Giovanni Schiaparelli and Percival Lowell, who claimed to see channels or canals on the planet's surface. Lowell specifically helped to foster a Martian mythology from these accounts, imagining lost civilizations that built uniform structures like the canals. Burroughs' story contextualizes these perceived structures as irrigation systems made by the red men of Mars, clearly indicating some influence from this popular interest in Mars specifically. For a movie made a century after this phenomenon and half a century after the canals were shown not to exist, the idea of Mars alone as a sort of sister planet to Earth would not make nearly as much sense. The Therns are introduced in a way that sort of implicates the rest of the universe in the story's rules. Specifically, they explain teleportation between planets as Thern technology that Carter is able to get a hold of, and they orchestrate what is in the book an organically arisen conflict between the people of Helium and Zodanga. As a side note, I plan on making more YouTube videos in the future on the topic of framing devices in genre fiction like this, but for now, I'll just say I really think it is important that Burroughs frames John's narrative as an actual piece of writing. What we read of his adventures are not third-person omniscient descriptions, but rather Carter's own account. When he mentions things like planetary teleportation without explaining them, we, as the audience, along with Burroughs' literal self-insert narrator, don't know whether he is 100% reliable. We are forced to make the choice to believe Carter, further stressing the overall product's reliance on his characterization as trustworthy and honest. Anyways, while I like the idea of John Carter taking on a sinister and large-scale threat like the Therns, I also do think that their placement in this story somewhat defies the original idea. It is meaningful that in a traveler's tale like A Princess of Mars or Star Trek, the challenges that the protagonist encounters are basically naturally occurring consequences of human nature running amok, as opposed to artificial contrivances, the overcoming of which is not nearly as much of a triumph of the protagonist's system of values over the primitive whims of our nature. That the Therns are behind so much of what goes on between Helium and Zodanga does fall into the contrivance category, in my opinion. The book carefully describes the Zodangans, its primary antagonistic presence, as militaristic and expansionist, but not outright evil, while the movie's primary antagonists, the Therns, have essentially zero human qualities besides a single-minded will to dominate. They attain this goal on planet after planet not because of their philosophy or will, but because they simply wield the most powerful technology in the universe, the Ninth Ray. It introduces a bit of power-scaly weirdness to the story that I don't think it needs. The book never really calls into question whether or not John Carter could physically defeat an enemy. He always can. And the question is more which customs and cultures are binding to Carter's way of thinking, and which ones he can discern to ignore or defy. The movie's Therns are a physical threat beyond Carter's capabilities, reducing some nuance between hero and villain, in my opinion. The best example of how this changes other parts of the film is the ending. The Therns send John back to Earth, and the film ends with the success of a clever trap he lays for them in order to take one of their teleporters and travel back to Mars. Now, I'm not saying it is really out of character for John Carter to set up a ruse or lie to his enemy, though it is ungentlemanly. But the triumphant shot of Carter shooting the Thern in the back from the movie does bother me somewhat. It would be a cool interpretation to suggest that some of John's values were worn away in the 10 years he spent obsessing over trying to get back to Barsoom, but there wasn't really time for that in the movie. Shooting someone in the back is a pretty universal sign of dishonor, and the film just kind of writes Carter into that corner by the end, which I think is unfortunate. Book John likely would have perished fighting a Thern head-on, an outcome the film takes as a given. Dejah Thoris. Let's talk about Dejah Thoris. I actually kind of have not as much to say about her part of this whole dynamic, but she is actually better in the movie, I think. She has a little more of a personality there, and she's a bit more complicated without overwriting her personality or character from the book. Though I do think we lose, because of time constraints, some good scenes between her and John where they sort of sort out the differences between their cultures. Political marriages between enemies are something that Carter's all-American sensibilities can't abide, and that, combined with a general freeness to express his feelings, make up his conflict with her, both in the book and in the film. Can he convince her that it's not worth letting customs destroy your pursuit of happiness, or will his objection to her traditions push her away too much? You get it, right? Okay. The two versions of this story also have somewhat different senses of humor, and I think both work. A Princess of Mars is a little warmer, perhaps a little sillier, and the movie John Carter adapts to the visual medium well with some slapstick and some 2010s quippiness before that whole thing kind of wore out its welcome. I hope people don't actually think I hate the movie, though, in conclusion, because I really like it. This video was made basically to say that many versions of ideas we see nowadays actually took fundamentally different forms when they first came to be. John Carter is a classic hero's journey story as a movie, but A Princess of Mars really is not, conforming more to the structures and goals of the traveler's tale, while combining it with the mythically strong protagonist trope present in things like Lord of the Rings or even like Beowulf. Clearly, those who produced the film wanted it to be accessible in form and made changes that raised the stakes for the world and took our protagonist on a personal journey to match his physical one. My question is this: has a book with the sensibilities of A Princess of Mars ever been adapted while keeping those sensibilities intact? I would love to know, and to watch whatever that may be. So let me know in the comments, along with whether or not I should actually read the rest of the Barsoom books if I loved the first one, because I did love the first one, and I think I plan to keep going with it. Okay, that was kind of a sprint. I just read a lot off of a teleprompter. You better have good listening comprehension skills. Bye-bye!